The screaming would not stop. It rolled through the marble hallways of the Marchetti house like a siren that never rested, bouncing off the high ceilings, slipping under closed doors, climbing the wide staircase until it reached every room in the house. Two small boys, barely 2 years old, stood in their crib, gripping the wooden rails, their faces red and wet, their voices raw from hours of crying. Nothing worked. Not the soft toys scattered across the floor, not the warm milk left untouched on the dresser, not even the lullaby that played on a loop from a small speaker in the corner. Dante Marchetti stood in the doorway of the nursery with his jaw tight and his hands pressed against the frame, as if the wood itself could hold him steady. He was a man who controlled entire streets of the city with a single word. Men twice his size lowered their eyes when he walked past. Yet here, in this soft yellow room filled with stuffed rabbits and hand-painted clouds on the wall, he felt powerless. "Get someone in here," he said without turning around. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge underneath it that made the guard standing behind him flinch. "Sir, we already called the last 2 agencies," they said. "I don't care what they said." Dante finally turned, and the guard took a step back at the look on his face. "My sons have not slept properly in 11 days. Find someone who can do this job, or find yourself another job." The guard nodded quickly and left. Dante stepped into the nursery and knelt beside the crib. Leo and Luca reached for him at once, their tiny fists grabbing the fabric of his shirt, their cries turning into hiccuping sobs as he lifted them, one in each arm. He was strong enough to carry both boys without effort, but strength meant nothing here. He could not carry away their pain. He could not undo what had happened 3 months ago, the night their mother had gone out for what was supposed to be a short drive and never returned. Since then, the house had become a place without music, without warmth, without the sound of a woman's laughter drifting from the kitchen. Nannies came and went. Some lasted a week, one lasted 3 days. The longest anyone had stayed was 9 days, and she left in tears, saying she had never seen children cry with such grief, as if they somehow understood that something in their small world had broken forever. Vittoria Marchetti, Dante's older sister, appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed and her heels clicking against the floor. She was a striking woman, with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, the kind of person who noticed everything and forgave very little. "Another one quit," she said. "It was not a question. I know. You cannot keep doing this to them, Dante. Every new face that walks through that door and then walks right back out, it teaches them that people leave. You are teaching your own sons that nobody stays." Dante closed his eyes for a moment, the twins still whimpering against his shoulders. "Do you have a better solution?" "I have a name," Vittoria said. "An agency I have never used before. Small, not well known, but they specialize in difficult placements. Children who have been through trauma. I already called this morning before you woke up. And they are sending someone this afternoon." Dante looked down at his sons, at their swollen eyes and trembling lips, and felt something close to desperation, a feeling he was not used to and did not like. "She better be good. Her name is Noelle Bianchi," Vittoria said, glancing at her phone. "The agency says she has a gift with children nobody else can reach." Dante said nothing. He had heard those words before, from 3 other agencies, about 3 other women who had failed within days. He carried his sons back to the crib, sang the same lullaby that never worked, and waited for the afternoon to come, bracing himself for one more disappointment. The knock came at exactly 2 o'clock. Salvatore Greco, Dante's most trusted man, opened the heavy front door and stepped back in mild surprise. Standing on the porch was a woman who did not look like any of the nannies who had come before her. She was not thin, not delicate, not dressed in the crisp uniform the agency usually required. She wore comfortable flat shoes, a soft cardigan the color of autumn leaves, and she carried a canvas bag over one shoulder instead of a suitcase. Her face was round and warm, her dark hair pulled back loosely, and there was something steady in the way she stood, feet planted, shoulders relaxed, as though nothing about this grand house intimidated her in the slightest. "Noelle Bianchi," she said, offering her hand. "I believe I'm expected." Salvatore studied her for a moment longer than necessary before shaking her hand. "This way." She followed him through the entrance hall, past the tall windows and the cold, polished floors, and Salvatore noticed she did not gawk at the wealth around her the way most people did. She simply walked, calm and unhurried, as if grand houses were nothing new to her, or perhaps nothing that impressed her at all. They found Dante in his study, sitting behind his desk with his head resting in one hand, the sound of his sons crying somewhere upstairs drifting faintly through the walls. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes moved over the woman standing in front of him with a flicker of doubt he did not bother to hide. "You're the nanny." "I'm the nanny," she confirmed, her tone even, unbothered by the way his gaze swept over her, clearly measuring her against some expectation she did not fit. "The last 3 women who stood where you're standing lasted a combined total of 18 days, Dante said. "My sons have not slept through a single night since their mother passed. If you're here to collect a paycheck and leave once things get difficult, save us both the trouble and walk back out that door now." Noelle did not flinch. "I don't leave difficult things, Mr. Marchetti. I run toward them. That's rather the point of my job." Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was certainty. He had built an empire recognizing the difference between people who talked a good game and people who meant what they said, and something told him this woman meant every word. "Fine," he said finally. "Let's see what you can do." He led her upstairs himself, past Vittoria, who watched the newcomer with narrowed, assessing eyes, and into the nursery, where the twins were still crying in their crib, their small chests heaving with exhaustion that had no outlet, no release. The moment Noelle stepped into the room, she did not rush toward them the way the others had, arms outstretched, voices too bright and too eager. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, lowered herself to the floor so she was at their eye level, and simply sat there, quiet, unmoving, letting the room exist around her without trying to fix it immediately. Dante watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expecting failure. Minutes passed. The boys continued to cry, though their eyes kept drifting toward the strange new shape sitting calmly on their floor. Noelle began to hum, low and soft, not the mechanical lullaby from the speaker but something older, something that sounded like it had been passed down through generations, a melody without obvious beginning or end. She did not look directly at the twins. She looked at the wall, at nothing in particular, as though she had all the time in the world and no urgent need for their attention at all. Slowly, the crying began to change. Luca's sobs grew softer, hitching less. Leo pressed his face against the crib rail, watching her with wide, wet eyes. 10 minutes passed. 15. The humming continued, patient and unhurried, and then Leo did something he had not done for any of the other women who had tried. He reached one small hand through the rail toward her. Noelle waited another moment before shifting closer, still humming, and let him wrap his fingers around one of hers. Luca watched his brother, then reached out too, gripping her other hand. Within 20 minutes, both boys had quieted into hiccuping breaths, their eyes heavy, their bodies finally beginning to relax against the crib mattress. Dante stood frozen in the doorway, unable to look away. "They're tired," Noelle said quietly, not turning around. "Exhausted, really. Grief in children this young doesn't look like sadness. It looks like this, like their whole bodies are trying to scream out something they don't have words for yet." She kept humming between sentences, her voice never rising above a murmur. "They don't need someone to fix them, Mr. Marchetti. They need someone who won't leave the room while they fall apart." By the time the sun began to set, both boys were asleep, their small hands still loosely curled where they had reached for her. Noelle rose carefully from the floor, her knees stiff from sitting so long, and turned to find Dante still watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "How long has it been since they slept for more than an hour?" she asked. 11 days, Dante said quietly. His voice had lost some of its earlier hardness. 11 days since either of them slept through more than an hour at a time. Noelle looked back toward the crib, at the 2 small chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. "They'll sleep tonight. Maybe not the whole night, not yet, but it's a start." Dante studied her for a long moment. Whatever he had expected when Vittoria mentioned this agency, it had not been this. A woman who walked into chaos and simply sat with it until it settled, who did not perform kindness for an audience, but seemed to carry it quietly, without needing anyone to notice. "You'll stay," he said. It was not quite a question. "That depends," Noel said, meeting his eyes without hesitation, "on whether you intend to trust me to do my job, or whether you plan to hover in doorways, measuring me against women who already failed." The corner of Dante's mouth twitched, something close to surprise, close to the beginning of respect. "I don't hover. You've been standing in that doorway for 40 minutes, Mr. Marchetti." He didn't answer that, because she was right, and they both knew it. Later that evening, after Noel had settled into the small guest room near the nursery, Vittoria found her brother in the study again, staring at nothing, a glass of untouched wine on the desk in front of him. "Well?" Vittoria asked, leaning against the doorframe. "They slept," Dante said simply, "both of them, at the same time, for the first time since." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, and Vittoria did not push him to. "I told you the agency was different," she said instead. "She's not what I expected." "No," Vittoria agreed, studying her brother's face carefully, noting something in his expression she had not seen there in months. "She isn't." Dante looked up. "Don't start. I haven't said anything." "You were thinking it very loudly." Vittoria allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one in weeks. "I was thinking that my nephews slept peacefully for the first time in 11 days, and that is worth celebrating, regardless of anything else." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Just be careful, Dante. We don't know anything about this woman yet. Not really. Salvatore is already running a background check." "Good," Dante said. "He should." But even as he said it, some part of him, the part that had watched her sit calmly on the nursery floor while his sons fell apart around her, already suspected that whatever Salvatore found would not matter nearly as much as what he had already seen with his own eyes. Upstairs, in the small guest room, Noel sat by the window and looked out over the dark grounds of the estate, the tall iron gates visible in the distance, the careful patrols of guards moving along the perimeter like shadows. She had taken this job because the agency paid well, and because she had a genuine gift for reaching children other people gave up on. She had not expected the house to feel the way it did, heavy with a grief that seemed to live in the walls themselves, nor had she expected the man who owned it to look at her the way he had, as though she were the first unexpected thing to happen to him in a very long time. She thought of the reasons she had left her last position, reasons she had not spoken aloud to anyone in this house, and did not intend to. She thought of the twins' small hands wrapped around her fingers, trusting her within minutes, when trust seemed like the hardest thing in the world for this family to offer. Whatever waited for her in this house, she suspected quietly, staring into the dark, it would not be simple, but for the first time in a long while, she did not feel like turning away from something simply because it was difficult. Down the hall, for the first time in 11 days, the Marchetti twins slept until morning. Morning came softer than the house had known in months. Noel woke before sunrise out of habit and found both boys already stirring, rubbing their eyes and reaching for the bars of their crib rather than crying for it. She lifted them one at a time, pressing a kiss to each small head, and carried them down to the kitchen where the staff had already laid out breakfast for the household. She had expected an empty kitchen at that hour. Instead, she found Dante seated at the long table, a cup of black coffee in front of him, still in yesterday's clothes, as though he had not slept at all. "You didn't rest," Noel said, settling the twins into their high chairs. "I kept checking on them," Dante admitted, a faint embarrassment in his voice, as though the confession cost him something. "Every hour or so, I kept expecting to hear crying. And? Nothing, just breathing, quiet, even breathing." He looked at her then, really looked, the way a man looks at something he cannot quite explain. "I haven't heard that sound in this house in 11 days. Noel busied herself spooning porridge into 2 bowls, giving him a moment to gather himself without the pressure of her attention. "It won't be perfect every night," she said gently. "Grief doesn't work on a straight line, even for children this young. There will be harder nights again, but last night tells me they're capable of settling, which is more than half the battle." "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," she said. "It's just patient. There's a difference." She handed Luca his spoon, already knowing he would fling more porridge onto the floor than into his mouth, and did not seem the least bit troubled by the mess that followed. Dante watched her wipe a smear of porridge from Leo's cheek, without any trace of irritation, and found himself, not for the first time that morning, unable to look away. Salvatore found him there 20 minutes later, still lingering at the table long after his coffee had gone cold, watching a woman he had known for less than a day feed his son's breakfast as though she had done it every morning of their lives. "You wanted to see me," Salvatore said, setting the folder down on the table. "Later," Dante said, rising finally, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the scene at the table, before he followed Salvatore toward the study. The next morning did not stay peaceful for long. Just after sunrise, Salvatore knocked on the study door and stepped inside without waiting for permission, a folder in his hand and a look on his face that made Dante set down his coffee immediately. "You said you'd run her background," Dante said. "Already?" "Overnight," Salvatore confirmed. "Some of it checks out. Employment history, agency references, all clean." He paused. "But there's a gap. Almost 8 months, about 2 years ago, where there's nothing. No job listed, no address on file, nothing, just silence." Dante's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Silence isn't a crime." "No," Salvatore agreed. "But in our world, silence usually means someone is hiding something, and we don't know this woman. We don't know who she talks to, who she's connected to, whether that silence is personal, or whether it's something we should be worried about." Dante looked toward the door, toward the sound of the twins' quiet morning chatter drifting down from the nursery upstairs, a sound he had not heard in months. "Watch her," he said finally. "Don't confront her yet. Just watch." Salvatore nodded and left, and Dante sat alone with his coffee going cold, staring at the folder Salvatore had left behind, wondering what exactly Noelle Bianchi was hiding, and why, despite every instinct trained into him over years of dangerous business, some part of him still did not want to believe it was anything that should frighten him at all. 3 weeks passed, and the house began to change in ways no one had expected. The twins woke each morning without screaming. Their laughter, once a distant memory, now echoed through the halls during breakfast, when Noelle would sit them in their high chairs and let them smear porridge across their faces while she told them silly stories about a family of rabbits who lived under the garden hedge. Leo had started saying her name, a clumsy toddler version that came out sounding like "no, no," and every time he said it, something in Dante's chest loosened just slightly. He found himself lingering near the nursery more often than his schedule allowed, standing just outside the door, listening to her voice drift through the wood, warm and unhurried, telling stories or singing softly while the boys played on the floor. He told himself it was simply relief, a father checking that his sons were finally being cared for properly. But some mornings he caught himself staying longer than necessary, watching the easy way she moved through the room, the patience she never seemed to run out of, and he knew it was becoming something more than relief. Vittoria noticed too, of course. Vittoria noticed everything. "You watch her the way you used to watch chess matches," she said one afternoon, finding her brother in the hallway outside the nursery again, arms crossed, clearly not going anywhere. "Like you're trying to figure out her next move before she makes it." "I'm making sure she's doing her job, for 15 minutes at a time, 3 times a day." Dante did not answer, and Vittoria's smile faded into something more serious. Salvatore mentioned the gap in her records, 8 months with nothing. "I know. Does it not concern you?" Dante glanced toward the nursery door, where he could hear Noelle's voice rising and falling as she read aloud from a picture book, the twins giggling at whatever silly voice she was using for one of the characters. "It concerns me," he admitted, "but not enough to send her away before I understand it." "That's not like you," Vittoria said quietly. "No," Dante agreed. "It isn't." That evening, after the twins had been put to bed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Dante found Noelle in the kitchen, sitting alone at the small table near the window, with a cup of tea cooling in front of her, her expression distant in a way he had not seen before. "You're not sleeping," he observed, leaning against the doorframe. "Neither are you, apparently," she said, glancing up with a small, tired smile. Occupational hazard, I suppose. I spend all day making sure two little boys feel safe enough to close their eyes. Doesn't leave much energy for closing my own. Dante crossed the room and sat down across from her, an act that surprised them both. He was not a man who sat casually in kitchens at night, sharing quiet moments with members of his staff, but something about the stillness of the house, the softness of the lamplight, made the usual rules feel less important. Salvatore found a gap in your employment history, he said, watching her carefully. 8 months, about 2 years ago, no record of where you were or what you were doing. Noelle's hands tightened slightly around her mug, but her expression remained steady. I wondered when that would come up. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I think I do, she said quietly, if you're going to trust me with your sons. She set the mug down and looked out the window at the dark garden beyond, gathering herself before she spoke. I was working for another family before this one. A good position, well paid, children I had grown genuinely fond of. And then the mother decided I did not look the way a nanny in her social circle was supposed to look. She said it plainly, without self-pity, though Dante could hear the old hurt still living underneath the calm delivery. She let me go without warning, without a reference, told her friends I had been unreliable, so no one would question it. It took 8 months to find work again, because every interview I walked into, I could see the same judgment in their eyes before I had said a single word. Dante was quiet for a long moment, something tightening in his jaw. That's why the gap. That's why the gap, Noelle confirmed. Not something dangerous, not something dramatic, just an ordinary kind of cruelty that doesn't show up neatly on paper. She looked at him directly then, something almost like a challenge in her eyes. I imagine that's disappointing, if you were hoping for something more exciting. No, Dante said, and he meant it. It isn't disappointing at all. Something shifted between them, in the quiet kitchen, something neither of them had words for yet. Noelle studied his face, the hard lines that seemed to soften slightly when he was not aware anyone was watching, and Dante studied hers, the steady strength that had walked into his house 3 weeks ago and quietly rearranged everything without asking permission. For what it's worth, Dante said finally, the people who let you go were fools. Noelle's smile this time reached her eyes, high praise, from a man who interrogated me on your doorstep the day we met. I apologize for that. You don't need to. You were protecting your sons. I understand that better than most. She hesitated, then added, more softly, it's rare, you know, finding somewhere that feels like it might actually want to keep you. Dante did not respond immediately, but something in his expression told her he understood exactly what she meant, and that whatever careful distance had existed between them until now had quietly begun to close. Over the following days, that closeness deepened in small, unremarkable ways. Dante began joining the twins for their morning meals more often, watching Noelle navigate their small chaos with an ease that still amazed him. He found reasons to walk past the nursery, to ask after the boys' progress even when he already knew the answer, to linger in doorways a little longer than necessary. Noelle, for her part, found herself looking forward to those brief exchanges more than she wanted to admit. There was something about the way Dante spoke to his sons when he thought no one important was watching, gentle and unguarded, so different from the controlled, careful man who ran his household and his business with an iron will, that made her curious about the person underneath the reputation. Salvatore watched all of this with growing unease, though he said nothing directly to Dante. Instead, he continued digging quietly into Noelle's past, less because he suspected danger now, and more out of old habit, the instinct that had kept the Marchetti family safe for years, refusing to fully stand down, simply because a woman had proven good with children. One afternoon, Noelle took the twins out to the garden for the first time since she had arrived, spreading a blanket beneath the old oak tree near the back of the property, while Leo and Luca chased a rubber ball across the grass, shrieking with laughter every time it rolled out of reach. Salvatore, stationed near the garden wall as part of the afternoon watch, found himself watching the scene longer than his duties strictly required. They haven't played outside in months, he said, when Noelle glanced up and caught him watching. Not since before. Fresh air is good for grieving hearts, Noelle said simply, catching Luca as he stumbled, and setting him back on his feet without breaking her sentence. Even small ones, especially small ones. Salvatore was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. "I've worked for this family a long time," he said finally. "Long enough to watch Isabella carry these boys before they were even born. Long enough to watch this house go dark after she passed." He paused. "I don't say this easily, but whatever it is you're doing, it's working. I wanted you to know someone besides Dante has noticed." Noel looked up at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice. "Thank you, Salvatore. That means more than you probably realize. The gap in your records," he said, more carefully now. "I looked into it because it's my job to look into everything. I'm not sorry I did, but I want you to know that whatever I find, it won't change how I see what you've done in this house these past weeks." "I appreciate that," Noel said. "Truly." He nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his post along the garden wall, leaving Noel to chase after Luca, who had discovered a patch of dandelions and was determined to pick every single one before nap time arrived. That evening, once the boys were bathed and settled, Vittoria found Noel in the small sitting room off the nursery, folding tiny shirts into careful stacks. "They're different," Vittoria said, leaning in the doorway. "The boys. I saw them in the garden today from my window. I haven't seen them run like that since before their mother passed. They still have hard moments," Noel said honestly, "especially at night, when the house goes quiet and there's nothing to distract them from missing her. But the hard moments are getting further apart." Vittoria crossed the room and sat down across from her, studying Noel's face with the same sharp attention she gave to everything. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I was suspicious of you the day you arrived. I still don't fully understand the gap in your history, and old habits make that hard to simply overlook. But I've watched you with my nephews for 3 weeks now, and whatever you're hiding, I don't believe it's anything that should worry this family." "Thank you," Noel said softly. "That means a great deal, coming from you." "Don't thank me yet," Vittoria said, though there was warmth beneath the words now, something that had not been there before. "I still intend to keep watching. Old habits, as I said." It was Vittoria who finally raised the subject that had been sitting unspoken in the house for weeks. "There's a visit scheduled for next month," she told Dante one evening, finding him in his study reviewing documents that had nothing to do with the twins for once. "Camille Ferro is coming." Dante's pen stopped moving. "Why?" "Officially, to discuss the shipping arrangements along the eastern route." Unofficially, Vittoria paused, choosing her words carefully. "You know how these things go. She'll be looking for weaknesses, and a household with 2 grieving toddlers and a new caretaker no one fully trusts yet might look like exactly the kind of weakness she's hoping to find." Dante set down his pen slowly, his earlier ease evaporating into something colder, more familiar. "Noelle doesn't need to be involved in any of that. She's living in this house, Dante, raising your sons under this roof. Whether you like it or not, she's already involved." Dante looked toward the door, toward the sound of Noelle's voice drifting faintly from upstairs, and felt the warmth of the past few weeks give way to something sharper, a familiar tightening of vigilance he had let slip for the first time in months. Whatever peace had begun to settle over this house, he understood now, was about to be tested. Camille Ferro arrived on a gray afternoon, stepping out of a black car with the practiced elegance of someone who had spent her life learning how to appear harmless while carrying every advantage in her pocket. She was tall, sharply dressed, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and the moment she walked through the front doors of the Marchetti estate, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. "Dante," she said warmly, extending a hand as though they were old friends rather than representatives of families that had circled each other warily for years. "It has been far too long. Camille." Dante's voice was even, controlled, giving nothing away. "This way. We can discuss the shipping routes in my study." "Of course." Her eyes swept the entrance hall as she spoke, cataloguing everything, the way people like her always did. "Though I must say, I heard the house was in some disarray, something about your sons. I do hope everything has settled." "Everything is fine." "Is it?" Camille's smile widened slightly. "I heard you went through quite a number of nannies before finding one who could manage them." "Must have been terribly difficult, losing their mother and then struggling to find someone suitable to fill the gap. Dante's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. My sons are well cared for. Shall we discuss business? Camille allowed herself to be led toward the study, but not before her gaze landed on Noelle, who happened to be crossing the hallway with Leo balanced on her hip, the toddler pointing excitedly at something outside the window. Camille's eyes lingered on the two of them for a long moment, something calculating passing behind her polite expression. And this must be the caretaker everyone speaks so highly of, Camille said, stopping in her tracks. Noelle paused, shifting Leo slightly on her hip, meeting the other woman's gaze without any visible discomfort. How lovely, Camille said, though the word came out with an edge underneath it. It's good to see the Marchetti household finding stability again, after such a difficult season. Families can be so very vulnerable during moments of transition, don't you think? Vulnerable in ways that outsiders sometimes find useful. The words were light, almost conversational, but Noelle heard the threat woven carefully underneath them, the same way she imagined everyone in this world had learned to speak, saying one thing while meaning something else entirely. The boys are very well protected, Noelle said simply, holding Camille's gaze steadily. In every way that matters. Something flickered in Camille's expression, surprise perhaps, or a kind of grudging respect for a woman who did not flinch under scrutiny. I'm sure they are. She turned back toward Dante, her polite mask sliding fully back into place. Shall we? Dante glanced once toward Noelle, a silent question in his eyes, and she gave the smallest nod to reassure him she was fine, before continuing down the hallway toward the nursery. But her heart was pounding harder than she let on, and as she settled the twins into their afternoon play, she found herself replaying Camille's words, turning them over, searching for exactly how much danger had just walked through the front door. She did not have to wonder for long. Later that evening, after Camille had left and the house had returned to its usual quiet, Noelle carried a tray of tea toward the study, intending to leave it outside the door, as she often did during Dante's late meetings. She was about to knock when she heard Vittoria's voice, low and urgent, drifting through the gap beneath the door. She was testing you, Dante, testing all of us. That comment about vulnerability during transitions was not idle conversation. I know what it was, Dante's voice replied, tight with restrained anger. The Ferro family has been circling for months, looking for any sign of weakness since Isabella died. A grieving household, a new caretaker with an unclear past, two young boys who could be used as leverage if anyone wanted to apply pressure. She was here to gather information, and now she has exactly the picture she wanted. Noelle stood frozen outside the door, the tray trembling slightly in her hands, understanding for the first time the full weight of what she had walked into weeks ago. This was not simply a job caring for grieving children. This was a household under quiet, constant threat, and she had unknowingly become part of the picture the threat was watching. She should have felt afraid. Some distant, sensible part of her whispered that she should set down the tray, pack her bag, and leave before morning, the way any reasonable person would, upon discovering the true danger surrounding this family. But when she thought of Leo's small hand curling around her finger on that first terrible afternoon, of Luca's laughter finally returning after months of silence, of the fragile trust both boys had placed in her, leaving did not feel like an option at all. She knocked before she could talk herself into anything else. The conversation inside stopped immediately. A moment later, Dante opened the door himself, his expression sharpening with something close to alarm when he saw her standing there, the tray of tea slightly unsteady in her hands. "I brought tea," she said simply. "But I think we both know that's not really why I knocked." Dante glanced past her, then stepped aside to let her in, closing the door behind them. Vittoria watched from her seat near the desk, her expression unreadable. "You heard," Dante said. "It was not a question." "Enough," Noelle admitted, setting the tray down carefully. "Enough to understand that this house is not simply grieving, it's under watch, and that my presence here, without a clear history, has apparently made things more complicated rather than less." "You should have been told from the beginning," Dante said, something like guilt shadowing his features. "This isn't a fair position to put you in." "Maybe not," Noelle agreed, "but I'm here now, and I understand the situation, and I have not changed my mind about staying." She looked between Dante and Vittoria, her voice steady, despite the fear she still felt curling somewhere beneath her calm exterior. Those boys need consistency more than anything else in the world right now. If leaving would make them safer, I would go without a second thought. But if my leaving simply hands the Pharaoh family exactly the instability they're hoping to find, then I am staying, and we will simply have to find another way to keep everyone safe. Vittoria studied her for a long moment, something in her sharp expression softening slightly, an old suspicion finally beginning to give way. "You're either very brave," she said slowly, "or you have no idea how dangerous this situation actually is." "Perhaps both," Noel said, "but I suspect fear has never solved anything that patience and steadiness couldn't handle better." Dante watched her, something settling behind his eyes that had not been there before, a quiet certainty replacing whatever doubt had lingered since the day she arrived. He had spent weeks watching this woman calm his sons through sheer patience and unshakable presence. He was beginning to understand that same steadiness extended to every part of who she was. "We increase security around the house," Dante said finally, turning to Vittoria. "Double the guards at the perimeter, additional watch on the nursery specifically, and nothing changes in the boys' routine. Whatever Camille Ferraud is hoping to see, she does not get to see fear in this house." Vittoria nodded, already reaching for her phone to make the necessary calls, though her eyes lingered once more on Noel before she left the room, a new kind of respect replacing the old wariness. Alone with Dante in the quiet study, Noel finally allowed some of her composure to slip, her hands trembling slightly as the full reality of the danger settled fully into her chest. Dante noticed immediately and crossed the room toward her, his expression gentler than she had ever seen it. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "After everything you just heard, you had every reason to walk away." "I know. Why didn't you?" Noel looked up at him, searching for the honest answer beneath the easy explanations she could have given. The paycheck, the professional commitment, the reputation she had built on never abandoning difficult placements. But standing there in the lamp-lit study, close enough to see the exhaustion and worry still etched into his face, despite his careful control, she found a truer answer waiting instead. "Because somewhere in the last month," she said softly, "this stopped feeling like just a job to me." Dante did not move, did not speak, but something passed between them in the quiet room, a understanding neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the additional guards Vittoria had summoned were already beginning to take their positions along the dark perimeter of the estate, and somewhere beyond those walls, the Pharaoh family was undoubtedly already planning their next move. But inside the study, for just a moment, neither Dante nor Noel was thinking about danger at all. In the days that followed Camille's visit, the household settled into a strange, watchful calm, the kind that comes before a storm everyone can feel but no one can yet see. Dante doubled the guards along the perimeter, exactly as he had promised, but he also made a quieter change that Noel noticed before anyone pointed it out to her. He began coming home earlier in the evenings, choosing to eat dinner at the family table rather than alone in his study, sitting beside the twins, while Noel guided their small hands through the mess of feeding themselves. "You don't have to do this every night," Noel told him, one evening as Leo attempted, with great seriousness, to feed a spoonful of mashed carrots directly to his father instead of himself. "I know," Dante said, accepting the carrots with far more grace than the moment probably deserved. "I want to. Vittoria mentioned you used to eat dinner at 7 every night without fail, business meetings included, before all this." "Things change," Dante said simply, wiping a smear of orange from his cheek. "I've realized there isn't a meeting in this world more important than this." Noel smiled, watching him carefully, and said nothing more, though something warm settled in her chest at the sight of him, a man capable of such control over his empire, undone completely by 2 small boys and a spoonful of carrots. Later that same week, Salvatore approached Dante privately with news that darkened the mood of the house considerably. 2 unfamiliar cars had been spotted circling the outer road near the estate on separate occasions, never stopping, never approaching the gates directly, but present long enough to suggest deliberate observation, rather than coincidence. "They're watching the house," Salvatore said grimly. "Testing our patrol patterns, probably, timing the guard rotations." "Camille's people," Dante said, though it was not a question. "Almost certainly." Dante's expression hardened into the same controlled fury Noelle had seen only once before, the day she had first arrived, and he had stood in the nursery doorway, helpless against his son's grief. This was a different kind of helplessness, the kind that came from a threat he could not simply outpatience the way he had learned to outpatience sorrow. "Increase the night watch," he said, "and say nothing to the boy's nanny that would frighten her unnecessarily. She's already agreed to stay through worse than idle threats. Let's not give her more to carry than she needs to." But Noelle, moving quietly through the halls that same evening with a basket of clean laundry, overheard enough of the conversation drifting from the study to understand exactly what kind of danger was circling the house, whether Dante intended to shield her from it or not. She said nothing, choosing instead to hold the twins a little closer that night as she rocked them to sleep, humming the old wordless melody until both boys drifted off completely, safe within her arms for one more quiet evening before the storm finally broke. The peace did not last. 3 nights later, well past midnight, the quiet of the house shattered when the security system's alarm tore through every hallway at once, red lights flashing along the perimeter fence where a section of the eastern wall had been breached. Noelle woke instantly at the sound of the alarm, her heart already pounding before her mind fully understood what was happening. She was out of bed and moving down the hallway toward the nursery before the second wave of red light swept across the walls, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. She found the twins already stirring, startled awake by the noise, their small faces confused and frightened in the flashing light. She scooped them both into her arms at once, murmuring low, steady reassurances, the same calm tone she had used on that very first afternoon weeks ago, even as her own pulse raced with fear. "It's all right," she whispered, though she did not fully believe it herself. "I've got you both. I've got you." Down the hallway, she could hear shouting, boots pounding against marble, Salvatore's voice barking orders to the guards stationed throughout the house. She pressed herself and the boys into the corner of the nursery farthest from the door and window, the spot Dante had shown her weeks ago during a security briefing she had barely paid attention to at the time, distracted as she had been by the twins' afternoon nap schedule. Now she was grateful beyond words that she had listened. The door burst open, and Noelle's breath caught before she recognized Dante's silhouette in the doorway, a weapon in his hand, and an expression of controlled fury on his face that softened instantly with relief when he saw her crouched safely in the corner, with both boys pressed against her. "They're here for the boys," he said, crossing the room quickly. "Pharaoh's people, testing whether we'd actually protect this house, or whether the rumors of instability were true. Salvatore has already caught 2 of them at the eastern wall, but there could be more." "The twins are safe," Noelle said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have them. Go do what you need to do." Dante hesitated only a moment, his eyes moving from his sons to the woman holding them so protectively, before nodding sharply and disappearing back into the chaos of the hallway. Noelle remained in the corner, humming softly despite the pounding of her own heart, keeping her voice level and calm for the sake of the 2 frightened boys clinging to her, even as shouts and the sound of a struggle echoed somewhere in the house below. It felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes, before the alarm finally cut off and an uneasy quiet settled back over the estate. Salvatore's voice called out from the hallway that the perimeter had been secured, that the intruders had been caught and would not be causing further trouble tonight. Noelle allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time since the alarm had sounded, pressing a kiss to each small forehead as the twins finally began to settle back into drowsy exhaustion in her arms. Dante returned a short while later, his expression grim but no longer sharp with panic. He found Noelle exactly where he had left her, rocking both boys gently, her cardigan wrapped around all 3 of them against the late-night chill. "They're safe," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, as though he needed to hear the words aloud to fully believe them. "Everyone is safe. They didn't even wake fully," Noelle said softly, looking down at the twins, both now fast asleep despite everything. "I think they trust that as long as I'm here, nothing can truly touch them." Dante crossed the room and knelt beside her, close enough that she could see the lingering fear still shadowing his eyes despite his outward composure. "I could have lost them tonight," he said, his voice rough. "And I could have lost you." "You didn't," Noelle said gently. "I know. But for those 20 minutes, not knowing whether the three of you were safe," he stopped, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to a man who had spent his whole life controlling every situation around him. "I don't know when it happened," he said finally, "but somewhere in the last month, you stopped being simply the person who cares for my sons. You became someone I could not imagine this house, this family, without." Noelle looked up at him, her own heart still racing from the danger of the night, from the fear that had gripped her while huddled in that corner, from the relief now flooding through her at his words. "Dante, I know this isn't the right moment," he said quickly, with the alarms barely silenced and men from the Pharaoh family sitting in restraints downstairs. "I know there is nothing simple about caring for someone in this life, in this house, but I needed you to know it regardless." Noelle reached out with her free hand, the twins still cradled securely against her, and gently touched his face, feeling the tension there finally beginning to ease beneath her palm. "I stopped thinking of this as simply a job weeks ago," she admitted softly. "I was only waiting to see whether you would ever admit the same thing." Whatever Dante might have said in response was interrupted by Vittoria's arrival in the doorway, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and lingering alertness. She took in the scene before her brother kneeling close beside the woman who held his sleeping son so protectively, and something in her sharp features softened completely for the first time since Noelle had arrived in this house. "The men Salvatore caught are being questioned," Vittoria said quietly. "We'll know more by morning about exactly what the Pharaoh family intended tonight and what they hoped to gain." "Whatever they hope to gain," Dante said, rising to his feet, his voice hardening with resolve. "They will not get it, not my sons, not this house, and not the people who protect it." Vittoria's eyes moved to Noelle, still cradling the sleeping twins in the corner of the nursery, and she offered a small, genuine smile, the last remnants of her earlier suspicion finally dissolving completely. "You didn't run," she said simply. "When the alarm sounded, when everything in this house was chaos, you stayed exactly where you were needed most." "I wasn't going to leave them," Noelle said simply. "Not tonight, not any night." "No," Vittoria agreed, glancing between Noelle and her brother with new understanding dawning in her expression. "I don't imagine you were." By morning, the household had regained a fragile sort of order. The broken section of the eastern wall was already being repaired by a team of workers Salvatore had called in before dawn, and the two men caught during the intrusion had been dealt with in a manner Dante did not discuss in front of Noelle or the twins, though the grim set of his jaw when he returned from the matter told her enough without words. She found him in the kitchen just after sunrise, staring at a cup of coffee he had not touched, the same posture she had discovered him in on her very first morning in this house, though the reason behind his exhaustion was entirely different now. "You should sleep," she said gently, setting the twins down to play with a set of soft blocks on the kitchen floor while she moved to sit across from him. "I will," Dante said, though he made no move toward it. "I keep thinking about how close it came. If Salvatore's men had been 30 seconds slower reaching the wall, if you hadn't known exactly where to take them." "But none of that happened," Noelle said firmly, reaching across the table to still his restless hands. "The boys are safe. I'm safe. You handled it exactly as you needed to." "I nearly lost everything that matters to me in 20 minutes, Dante said, his voice low. "I've built walls around this family for years, hired the best guards money can buy, and it still wasn't enough to stop them from breaching the perimeter." "No system is perfect," Noelle said, "but you didn't fail last night, Dante. You responded. You protected your family the moment it mattered most. That's not failure. That's exactly what a father is supposed to do." Dante looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, and finally allowed himself to relax slightly under her steady certainty, the same certainty that had calmed his sons on her very first afternoon, in this house now working its quiet effect on him as well. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying calm when I could not be there to make sure of it myself." "That's what I'm here for," Noelle said softly, though even as she said it, Both of them understood the words, no longer fully captured what she had become to this family, something far beyond the simple duties of a hired caretaker. The following days brought careful, quiet changes to the household. The men caught during the break-in confirmed what everyone had already suspected, that Camille Ferraud had ordered the attempt specifically to test the strength of the Marchetti defenses and to gauge whether the household's recent instability made it a viable target for further pressure. Dante spent long hours in his study with Salvatore and other trusted advisors, planning a response that would ensure the Ferro family understood clearly that any further attempts against his family would carry consequences far greater than they were prepared for. Through it all, Noëlle continued her quiet work with the twins, though the household around her had shifted in ways both subtle and significant. Vittoria now sought her out for actual conversation rather than suspicious observation, asking her opinion on the boys' routines, sharing stories about their mother that helped Noëlle understand the family's history more completely. Salvatore, once wary of her unexplained past, now nodded respectfully whenever their paths crossed in the hallways, having witnessed firsthand her unwavering loyalty during the crisis. And Dante found himself no longer hiding the fact that he sought out her company, not simply as the caretaker of his sons, but as someone whose presence had become essential to his own sense of steadiness in a life that rarely allowed for softness. Evenings that had once been spent alone in his study now often included her, sitting together after the twins had been settled for the night, sharing quiet conversation that had nothing to do with schedules or security concerns at all. "You know," Noëlle said one such evening, curled into the armchair across from his desk with a cup of tea warming her hands, "when I took this position, I expected difficult children and a difficult employer. I did not expect any of this." "Any of what specifically?" Dante asked, though the small smile playing at the corner of his mouth suggested he already knew. "This," she said simply, gesturing between them. "Whatever this has become. Is that a complaint?" "No," Noëlle said softly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "It's an observation, and perhaps, if I'm honest, a rather welcome surprise." Dante rose from behind his desk and crossed the room to sit in the chair beside hers, rather than across from her, close enough that their hands rested only inches apart on the small table between them. "The Ferro situation isn't finished," he said quietly, the weight of responsibility never fully leaving his voice even in moments like this. "There will be more to handle before this house is truly safe again." "I know," Noëlle said, "but I'm not going anywhere while you handle it." Dante reached over and took her hand in his grip careful but certain, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the quiet study while the rest of the house slept peacefully around them, safe for tonight and increasingly hopeful for all the nights still to come. 2 weeks after the failed break-in, Dante called a meeting that would settle the matter with the Ferro family once and for all. He did not travel to their territory, nor did he send Salvatore in his place. Instead, he invited Camille Ferro directly to his own house, on his own terms, a decision that made Vittoria raise her eyebrows in surprise when he informed her of the plan. "You want her back in this house, after what her people attempted here? I want her to see exactly what her people failed to break," Dante said calmly. "I want her to walk through these halls and see a family that is stronger now than it was before she ever tried to test it." Camille arrived precisely on time, her composure as polished as ever, though something wary flickered behind her eyes as she stepped through the front doors, clearly uncertain what kind of reception awaited her after the failed attack. She found Dante waiting in the main hall rather than the study this time, with Vittoria and Salvatore standing at his sides, a deliberate show of unified strength. "I trust you understand why I'm here," Camille said carefully, her usual confidence noticeably restrained. "I understand exactly why you're here," Dante replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "You sent men into my home in the middle of the night, believing my family was weak enough, distracted enough, to be tested without consequence. I wanted you to see for yourself how thoroughly you were mistaken." As if summoned by the moment itself, Noëlle appeared at the top of the staircase, a twin balanced on each hip, both boys laughing at something she had said moments before, utterly unaware of the tension in the hall below. She paused at the top of the stairs, taking in the scene, before offering Camille a polite but entirely unbothered nod, the same steady composure she had shown during their first uncomfortable meeting weeks earlier. Camille's eyes moved between the woman on the stairs, the two thriving, healthy boys in her arms, and Dante's unshakable expression, and something in her calculating gaze finally shifted, recognizing that whatever weakness she had hoped to exploit no longer existed, if it ever truly had. "It seems," Camille said slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone recalculating an entire strategy, "that I misjudged the situation." "You did," Dante agreed simply, "and I would advise your family to remember this visit clearly, should anyone consider testing my household again in the future. What you attempted here failed completely, and it cost you 2 men currently unable to report back to you at all. I trust that message is clear enough." Camille held his gaze for a long moment, then inclined her head slightly, a gesture that in their world served as both acknowledgement and retreat. "Clear enough," she said. "I believe our business today is concluded." She left without further conversation, her car disappearing down the long drive, and the moment the front doors closed behind her, the tension that had gripped the household for weeks finally began to release its hold. Vittoria let out a long breath, Salvatore's shoulders visibly relaxed, and Dante turned to look up at the staircase where Noel still stood with his sons, safe, unharmed, and entirely unbothered by the danger that had just walked through their front doors and back out again. "It's over," Dante said, more to himself than to anyone else, as though he needed to say the words aloud to fully believe them. "For now," Vittoria said practically, though even she could not hide the relief in her voice. "But I suspect the Ferro family will think twice before testing us again." Over the following weeks, the Marchetti household settled into a new rhythm, one built not on the fragile grief that had defined it for months, but on something steadier, something that felt, for the first time since Isabella's passing, genuinely like healing. The twins grew stronger and more confident each day, their laughter filling rooms that had once echoed only with silence and sorrow. Vittoria found herself spending more time at the house than she had in years, drawn back by the warmth that had returned to it, often finding Noel in the garden with the boys, and staying far longer than any business would require. And Dante, the man who had once stood frozen in doorways, uncertain how to comfort his own grieving sons, found himself transformed in ways he could never have predicted the day Noel Bianchi first walked through his front door. He no longer hovered anxiously outside the nursery, uncertain and helpless. He joined mornings there freely, sitting on the floor with his sons, the way he had watched Noel do that very first afternoon, patient and present in a way grief had once made impossible. One evening, several months after Camille Ferro's final visit, Dante found Noel in the garden after the twins had been settled for the night, sitting on the same bench where she often watched the sunset, a quiet habit he had come to look forward to sharing with her. "I've been thinking," he said, settling beside her, "about what this house was like the day you arrived, and what it's become since." "It's become a home again," Noel said softly, watching the last light fade over the garden, "rather than simply a house full of grief." "Because of you," Dante said. "I don't think I've said that plainly enough, in all these months. This family healed because you refused to give up on any of us, even when you had every reason to walk away." "I never wanted to walk away," Noel said, turning to face him fully. "Not from the boys, and not from you." Dante reached for her hand, the same steady gesture that had become familiar between them over the past months, though tonight there was something more deliberate in the way he held it, something that made Noel's heart quicken with anticipation. "I know I am not an easy man to build a life with," Dante said carefully. "My world carries danger that will never fully disappear, responsibilities that will always demand pieces of my attention. But these past months, watching you become such an essential part of this family, of my sons' lives, of my own life, I find I cannot imagine any version of our future that does not include you fully, not simply as the person who cares for my sons, but as someone I hope will choose to stay by choice, for as long as you're willing to have us." Noel felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, the culmination of months of careful, quiet devotion finally finding its full expression in his words. "I chose this family a long time ago, Dante," she said softly, "the moment those boys reached for my hands through the crib rails on that very first afternoon, Some part of me already knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Dante drew her closer, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them said anything more, simply sitting together in the garden as the last light faded completely into evening, the house behind them warm and alive, with the sound of two small boys sleeping peacefully upstairs, safe and secure in a family that had finally, fully healed. A year passed, and on a warm spring afternoon almost exactly 1 year after Noel had first walked through the front doors of the Marchetti estate, the whole household gathered in the garden beneath the old oak tree to celebrate the twins' 3rd birthday. Streamers hung between the branches, and a small table had been set with a cake far too large for 2 children who would only eat the frosting, and the sound of laughter filled the grounds in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that first desperate afternoon. Vittoria arrived early to help with preparations, teasing Salvatore about the crooked banner he had insisted on hanging himself, despite Noel's gentle suggestion that he let someone taller handle it. Even Salvatore, usually so composed, found himself laughing along with the rest of them, a sound Noel had rarely heard from him during those first tense weeks of her employment. "Do you remember," Vittoria said, settling beside Noel on the garden bench as they watched Dante chase both boys across the lawn, scooping them up one after the other to shrieks of delighted laughter. "The day you arrived, I was so certain you would last a week, like all the others." "I remember," Noel said, smiling. "You watched me from the doorway like I was about to steal the silver." "In my defense, I had good reason for caution," Vittoria said, though her tone was fond rather than defensive. "This family has been hurt before. I only wanted to make sure it wouldn't happen again." "I understood," Noel said. "I understand it still." They watched together as Dante finally set the twins down near the cake, both boys immediately reaching sticky fingers toward the frosting despite everyone's best efforts to delay them a few minutes longer. He caught Noel's eye across the garden and smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that had become so familiar over the past year, nothing at all like the hard, controlled expression he had worn the day they first met. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the twins had finally succumbed to the exhaustion of a full day of celebration, Dante found Noel in the nursery, watching both boys sleep peacefully in the beds they had only recently graduated into from their crib. "They had a good birthday," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "They did," Noel agreed. "A whole year of good days now, more than not." Dante reached for her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing, and together they stood watching the boys sleep, safe and whole and thoroughly loved, in a house that had once known only grief and now knew, above all else, the steady, unshakable presence of the woman who had refused to leave when leaving would have been so much easier. In the months that followed, the Marchetti household became known, quietly, among those who mattered, as something unusually solid, a family that danger had tested and failed to break, held together by a woman no one had expected to matter as much as she ultimately did. Leo and Luca grew into confident, joyful boys who never remembered a time when their house had echoed with anything other than laughter, their earliest memories built entirely around a woman who had refused to leave them, no matter how difficult the days had once been. And Dante Marchetti, a man once defined entirely by the ruthless control he held over his world, discovered that the greatest strength he had ever found was not in power or fear, but in the steady, unshakable presence of a plus-size maid who had walked through his front door one desperate afternoon and never truly left, becoming not simply the person who saved his sons from their grief, but the person who finally, fully, brought his family home.